There's never any single, or very rarely is there any single clear answer in economics, which was actually why I found it so so enjoyable to do economics, because at school we were always taught that there was one right answer. Even in subjects such as history, there was the correct answer, and then everything else was incorrect. And when one came up to university to do economics, one soon discovered that actually there wasn't a single answer, and I found that that it was enormously sort of relieving, and it was like being freed from shackles, so that one could think for oneself rather than try and memorize what one was told was the correct answer. I started as a historian. When I specialized at school, I specialized in history. And again, I think that economics is a splendid subject, not only because there isn't one correct answer to most of the questions that we get asked, but also because I think it's a very good mixture of history, of knowing what has happened in the past and how we got where we are at the moment, and a much more rigorous mathematical analysis. And I think that the combination of history and mathematics is a very good, very valid one, and in a sense puts us apart in a way from some of the other social sciences. Now, having said that, and I think that the subject from time to time varies too much in one direction. I have been doing monetary analysis, and with particular reference to central banking. And for a time, in the 1960s, I was at LSE with Richard Sayers. And I think that the Sayers School that he established at LSE was much too historical, with too little sort of attempt to frame it within the analysis, within a mathematical, rigorous framework. But equivalently, I think that in recent years, it's been very upsetting for me that history has been downgraded, and indeed that economic history is no longer not only not required as part of the undergraduate economics syllabus, but also that the whole sort of thrust of the subject has gone far too mathematical, with far too little reference and under appreciation of historical evolution. As a sort of monetary economist, I've been doing a lot on regulation and supervision. And one of the things that, in a sense, most upsets me about a lot of current economic theorizing and analysis is that it assumes that the legal and institutional structure is given and static, so that the only thing that happens is you get various shocks to the economy, and it all remains the same. And particularly if you look at what has been happening since the great financial crisis in 2008, that's not the way it works. And the way it works is you get a shock. That has certain effects, obviously some of which in many cases are adverse. And one of the results of that is you get a change in the institutional structure, for example in the financial regulatory system. That in turn feeds back into the way that agents behave. So you get sort of a development which again at various times you will get a new shock coming. So you get a sort of continuous sort of evolutionary, and what we don't have at the moment in economics is an evolutionary equilibrium in which the institutional and regulatory structure is changing along with the economy and with the severity of economic shocks. If you take a particular point of time and you assume that everything in the way of the underlying structure of the economy is going to be constant, then it is almost always possible to define or set out a set of rules which will be optimal, partly because of the time inconsistency problem. Within a given structure, they will do better than discretion. But if you assume that the underlying structure is going to change, and change in ways that you simply can't appreciate, then almost any rule that you initially set out will turn out to be mistaken, fallible, far less than optimal, because you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know how the structure is going to change. You don't know how agents are going to behave. The world changes, and if the world changes, you need sufficient flexibility to change the way that you operate within that. I'd say you can't. That no one has that degree of insight about the future, and the future is unpredictable, and we just don't know. And this is Keynesian uncertainty, and again, and I think one of the key issues between those who describe themselves as post-Keynesians and those who describe themselves as neoclassical, neo-Keynesians, whatever, is that the latter group seem to believe that you know enough about the probability distribution to be able to come to some reasonably accurate judgment. Well, the Keynesians argue that there is, or the post-Keynesian argue, that there is so much uncertainty around that you actually can't do that, that most decisions involve a leap of faith, which they do, because we can't predict. And again, that's another feature that I feel very strongly about with respect to the use of economists in the modern world, which is overall economists are primarily used for forecasting. And that's what we actually cannot do. We can't do it. And our forecasts are horribly fallible. And I think that it would be much better if we were used to express what are the risks, what are the potential dangers that we see, rather than try to do a forecasting, which we really don't have the capability of doing. And, yes, we can forecast 6 months ahead to a degree, because there's a great deal of momentum within the economy. If you don't have something like Brexit bringing about a sudden major change, normally there's a great deal of momentum. But by the time you're coming sort of 2 years down the road, you really don't know very much. And here I would very strongly sort of recommend Mervyn King's recent book, with the emphasis on uncertainty rather than the risk embodied in a probability distribution. To take one particular topical example, we've had the decision to leave the EU and Brexit. That brings about a huge degree of uncertainty. We don't know what the effect of that uncertainty is going to be over the next quarter, let alone sort of in 2017. There's a very wide range of potential outcomes, and even for this quarter. One of the complaints that I have about the use of economists is the way that they're used to try and provide forecasts, which really not possible. And to give a kind of analogy, it's as if you were trying to do a weather forecast where your own forecast will influence the weather. The weather's, and forecasting the weather is difficult enough beyond about 5 days away, but the forecast that we make of the weather doesn't influence the weather itself. But in economics, the forecasts that we make influence how people behave and how they respond. And that just makes it another degree of difficulty. And if meteorology is difficult enough, in forecasting. And economics is just a sort of quantum level more difficult. As I said earlier, I think that there should be much more history. If there had been more greater reliance in history, I think there would have been an appreciation or greater appreciation that a combination of a housing boom and credit expansion was highly dangerous. And what happened to a degree was that in the US there were wonderful data on housing, all aspects of the housing market, and which went back to the early 1950s. And for 50 years you had monthly data on housing prices and all that. And during these 50 years, if you held a diversified portfolio of houses across all the states in the US, there was only, I think, 1 or 2 quarters where housing prices overall, on average, fell. I mean, there were crises in New England at one stage and in the oil-producing states at another. But if you diversified, you seemed to be safe. If you took these 50 years and ignored history elsewhere, and you ran your sort of econometric analysis and assumed that the future was going to be like the past of those 50 years, it actually came about that you reckoned that a decline in housing prices over the whole of the United States of more than about 4 or 5% was an almost unimaginable event. And it was basically on that premise that people went into, for example, all the subprime stuff, because it didn't matter if you were lending to poor people who were likely to get ill, who were in the fringes of the labor market and so on, because if they couldn't repay you for one reason or another, if housing prices didn't go down, you could foreclose and you would still be safe, because you wouldn't lose any money. Because you could sell. And the whole of the subprime and the rest of it, which initially was done for the best of intentions, and it was to try and get the disadvantaged of America into the housing market. And if you could rely on ever-rising housing prices, it would have worked. But you couldn't, and history would have shown you that. So I would want to start by reinstating history to a far greater extent into the syllabus. And the history not only of one country, because again, any country has a sort of particularity. I want to have a history of 2 or 3 countries. And apart from that, I would hope there would be very much more humility. And to some extent, also an appreciation that many of the mathematical models which are constructed, and many of them are constructed with a sophistication and a technical brilliance which is, in many ways, remarkable and very good, but they depend on their assumptions. And the assumptions of these models are frequently so extreme. And that particularly relates to what are known as the micro-founded DSGE models. To take one example, prior to the 2008 great financial crisis, the assumption in these models was that you could assume that everyone was the same, a representative agent, because no one ever defaulted. But if no one ever defaulted, either for strategic reasons or accidentally, then you never needed a bank, because everyone could borrow or lend at the riskless rate. And you didn't need money, because if nobody ever defaults, then your individual IOU is entirely acceptable for any purchase of anything, anywhere. So you don't need money. So, and the whole sort of basis of the construction of a financial monetary system depends ultimately on default. And it's And as my friend Dimitri Somakos mentioned, you need default in order to construct a financial system, just as you need the devil and sin in order to construct a religious system. And it doesn't work unless things can go desperately wrong. In both cases, both for religion and for economics and finance. And by having excluded what can go wrong within the financial system, they didn't have as a result of financial system. And to some large extent, they still don't. And that's one of what I mean by saying that the so-called micro foundations are not proper foundations at all. They simply don't reflect the reality of life. But trying to do so, trying to get a model that reflects all the complications of life is such, particularly when we get the evolution that I was talking about in the underlying legal and institutional structure, is so complex that we're really a very, very long way from doing it. But as long as we're such a long way from constructing a model that approximates to reality at all, we have to be much more humble about what we can learn from these models.